Hello and welcome to the Bird Fly podcast about living freely in a world given back to us. This is Wade here with Michael as we are continuing our YouTube videos on words to know. We're going to have two that we're recording today, and this one is going to be on covenant. And I will say, if I may say, Michael's dressed very nicely today. I think it's very fashionable.
Thank you.
And if you want to know why he's doing this, you should listen to episode 215, Anthropology Part 3, and right in the intro, the occasion for this is explained, but I like it. It's bold, and I'm going to say it's beautiful.
All right, thank you.
I am, as usual, dressed like a fat man.
No, you look great.
Thank you. We're going to be discussing then covenant, and then in the second video we're going to talk about promise, and these two will build off each other. We're doing words you should know, words to know kind of early on. So we've done big ones like grace, mercy. And I thought covenant would be a good one to talk about, partly because we've been doing Genesis for the anthropology episodes. Partly because when I was in California, I talked about covenant, going through Genesis 1 through 22. And in the Lord's Supper, we hear sometimes the term New Covenant or New Testament. And so as we think about how God deals with us, I think if we can do covenant then promise, this is a good way to get at law and gospel, which are going to get their own word episodes, videos on here eventually. But when we think of God's relationship with his people, especially in the Old Testament, that word covenant becomes very important. He makes a covenant with Abraham. You think Genesis 15, and you have the offerings are cut in half, and God passes through.
We should talk about the Hebrew. Like the verb for making a covenant is literally cut a covenant, right?
Yeah.
Where you would
cut a deal.
Cut an animal in half, and it seems, at least biblically, that the two parties walk through the bloody carcass, and it's kind of the indication was if you don't keep your side of the covenant, that's how you end up.
Yeah, which would be, I'm glad we don't do that like when we buy a used car now.
Although
I kind of wish they had to do it when they're selling me one.
Even worse was, I don't know how graphic we can get, but you would maybe put your hand on the inner thigh of another man.
Here, I'll show you guys what
And I think I don't have an explanation of this other than to say, you're in a vulnerable place right now, and so there's trust there, right? So, and I'll make one point and then come back to you. I like to tell the students who are new to the Old Testament or even familiar with the Old Testament to realize how serious the ancient world was about keeping their words. So we can point out all sorts of human rights violations. It was a debaucherous, violent place, but they are morally superior, if we want to talk about that way, when it comes to keeping their words and making promises than we are. We know that we're lied to all the time.
We sign contracts without reading them.
Right.
I do that with my phone every time. I just scroll down, accept, and I'm just going to get mad if I don't like what it says when I find out later.
And we lawyers can build stuff and take stuff apart. And it's kind of our culture. So these words and these customs actually tell us something about that time, and also about how God keeps his word. Okay.
Yeah. And so we get this, and what I'd like to do is play out especially how Paul will approach this in the New Testament then. So we have the idea of the covenant, the cutting the deal, and Mike, you mentioned, and this is very important, usually both parties would walk between that. So if I was buying a car, I would walk through, the salesman would walk through, and both parties would do this. And if we think of the covenant in the Old Testament, most people think of the Old Covenant, and by that they mean the law, the Mosaic law, and not just the Ten Commandments, but the ceremonial law, the civic law. Keep these things, do these things, and this will happen. In the Ten Commandments, we see that in the fourth commandment, where God kind of makes this, attaches this promise of how it will go if you honor father and mother. And so when Paul is writing in the New Testament, and especially in Galatians, but elsewhere too, he when he encounters those who want to have Jesus and usually those coming from a Jewish background, what they wanted was Jesus and circumcision or dietary laws. The Gentiles had their own ands that they could add as well, usually from Greek philosophy or pagan religion. And Paul says, if you're really sons of Abraham, you should realize that Abraham wasn't saved by the old covenant. He does this in Galatians and Romans. In fact, there's an older covenant than the old covenant, than Sinai, which was a two-way covenant, right? This is two sides. And that's the covenant that God made with Abram, or with Abraham. And there, only God walked through. Abraham sees this in a dream. Only God walked through, and this was a one-way covenant. This covenant then was gospel. And we'll get into this in promise too, but we're told Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. And then Jesus in the New Testament will institute a new covenant, a New Testament, and I'll leave it to you, Mike, if you want to unpack why maybe testament language we like sometimes. A new covenant as well, which is one way. He fills this cup with forgiveness, life, and salvation with his blood, having drunk down the cup of God's wrath to its dregs for us. And he freely gives. This again is grace. And so I'll throw it to you, Michael, anything with the one-way covenant idea, or maybe that word testament that can sometimes be used for covenant.
Yeah, so the Abrahamic covenant is one way, God promise, a promiso, right? And then the Mosaic covenant would be two-way. There's going to be, hey, you do this, and there's going to be ramifications either
which
good
is
or bad.
exactly how human beings normally relate to each other.
It's really good for law and order in this sinful world. It's
Yep.
really bad when it comes to love and the family, right?
Yeah.
So, by the way, you could exchange two kinds of righteousness for this too. It's all the same thing. Are you
Yep.
trying to be righteous by law or through faith? Okay. So the Testament, when Jesus talks about the New Testament in his blood, I think certainly if you're a Jewish thinker and reader of the Hebrew Old Testament, that makes sense, right? There's a new covenant, and you would also think of Jeremiah. There's something new coming with the Messiah, but it's not really new. It's the same grace,
Right. Yeah.
We're just on the different side of the
It's
timeline.
the old
Yeah.
one. Yeah.
So and Paul makes a big deal about that. There's the older one, the Abrahamic, as you said.
Yeah.
So this is a new covenant in two ways. One, it goes back to the old promise, sort of, but also it's on this side of the timeline, right? Now it's actually, it's not a promise of something that is going to happen. It is a delivery of what had happened, right? The blood of Christ now is given to you, the same blood that was crucified on the cross. We like that word testament there because when Jesus is making a testament or a covenant or agreement, this is legal language.
Yep.
And so if you're talking in legal language there, you want to be precise. So when he says, this is my body, this is my blood, he's not writing a poem. He's writing something that's precise there.
Yep.
And that's a part.
On the night he was betrayed, as he's getting ready to die.
You could even go so far as to say this is his last will and testament. He says, do this in remembrance of me. It's Maundy Thursday, Mandate Thursday, where he gives the command to love, but also do in remembrance of me. So that's it's not the whole thing, but it's a part of the argument, a part of the discussion when we decide, is this really Christ's body and blood? Is this a symbol? How does this work out? So it's important for us to understand the genre we're in, and this was covenant, testament, legal language.
Yeah, and then to remember, as Christians, how new and different a thing that God is doing with this. That covenant language, especially in American history, because it was so influenced by the Reformed. And the Reformed kind of latch on to covenant language too. Think of like the Pilgrims, and things of that sort.
You still see this, the contract with people.
Yeah. And like sometimes this American exceptionalism, like this covenant we have with God as a Christian nation, and we've done episodes on that. But as Lutherans, what we want to emphasize is how radically different this covenant is. This new covenant, which is really the old covenant, Abraham's covenant as well, and going back to even Adam and Eve, right? And testament there, I like as well that picture of last will and testament, right? Someone has died. And now this is one way they're leaving things to you. And the idea of testament in there too, the will used to be one thing, and the testament was where the person in there talked about their faith, right? They commended themselves into God's hands. And so when we think of what Jesus is doing with the New Covenant or Testament, he's doing both. He's leaving his body and blood for the forgiveness of sins, but he's also, that is a testament. It preaches something, it speaks something of what he has done for us.
And we hear that, right? Whenever
Yep.
you eat and drink of this cup, you have preached Christ. Yeah.
Yeah. That's where there's never a service with the Lord's Supper that doesn't have a good sermon.
Yeah.
Because even if I drop the ball, the words of institution, and it's a nice short sermon
It's a good one.
as well. So hopefully that's a little helpful on covenant. Anything else you got on that, Mike?
No, we've been talking promise already, right? This
Yeah.
is all promise, so we should go to that real quick.
Right, and in the meanwhile, if you are enjoying these, subscribe to the YouTube channel, share them, and we appreciate it. And no matter what you decide to do, let the bird fly.